Today, as I said, we're here with Jennifer Aaker, the General Atlantic Professor at Stanford in the Graduate School of Business, who will be talking today with Steve Clayton, the VP of Global Public Affairs and the Chief Storyteller at Microsoft. Among other things, they're going to be talking about Steve's journey in transforming the way that Microsoft communicates, both internally and with the world. And with that, we are going to get started. Thank you for being here, both of you, and take it away.
Thank you, Robin. It's so wonderful to be here. Among a few classes that I teach at Stanford, Power of Story is one. And I think there's no more popular guest than Steve Clayton that we could have here today. So I'm really excited to talk with you, Steve. Thank you for being here. Let's start with just the facts. You are among a couple of titles that you have, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. You are also the Chief Storyteller Officer at Microsoft. So can you tell us a story about how that role came to be and how you became part of it?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Robin and Jennifer. It's great to be here, and just amazing to see, how many people are excited to hear about storytelling. So I hope we can do it justice from the stories here at Microsoft. But I'll sort of tell you a quick two-part story of how I ended up A, at Microsoft, and then B, in this job of storytelling, because I always like to start with the story. The fast version of the story is about, I joined Microsoft in '97, but I left university, I think in '91 or '92, and I went to work for a company in the UK. I'm originally from the UK, despite this accent that sits mid-Atlantic these days. But I worked for a company in the UK that many of you will know. It was called Zeneca back then. It's now called AstraZeneca, obviously one of the producers of the COVID vaccine. But I worked in the IT department at Zeneca straight out of university. And in that IT department at Zeneca, we spent lots of time working with Microsoft. We were one of the biggest customers of Microsoft. And this is way back 25, 28 years ago, something like that. And so I got to know lots of people at Microsoft incredibly well. And so much so, about 3 years into the job at Zeneca, I get a phone call and I'm in the office and I pick up the phone and I said, "Hi, it's Steve." And the person on the other end of the phone says, "Steve, it's Paul from Microsoft." And he says, "Listen, well, I'm not really supposed to do this." He says, "But would you be interested in a job at Microsoft?" And I said, "Well, I'm flattered. I would love to have a job at Microsoft." And he said, "Great, I'll put you in touch with the HR team at Microsoft and we'll get you through the process." So I go through this very long interview process, multiple different, rounds of interviews, and ultimately get offered the job at Microsoft. And so I go back to Zeneca on a Monday morning, I go into my boss's office and I say, "Hey, I've accepted a job at Microsoft and I'm going to be joining Microsoft." And actually what I should have said earlier in the story is every month, a group of people from Zeneca, from the IT department, would go to visit Microsoft at the head office in a place called Reading in England. And so that's how I'd got to know the team at Microsoft very well. So I walk into my boss's office and I say, "Hey, I've accepted this job at Microsoft and, my start date is in a month's time." And he says, "We're sorry to lose you, but let's just work through this final month period and finish up your projects here at Zeneca." And so I had a month left working at Zeneca. And during this month, we had one of these regular visits to the Microsoft office in Reading. And so I arrive at the Microsoft office, we have a day of meetings, meet with all of the team at Microsoft, and then we wrap up the day of meetings. And as you do, you go to the pub for a few drinks after the meetings, because I like to say that all good stories start or end in a pub. So I'm in the pub, I'm with a friend from Zeneca, and the door to the pub opens. It's this beautiful country pub. It's called The Bull in a place called Sonning. If you ever find yourself in that area, The Bull at Sonning is a fabulous pub on the banks of the River Thames. The door to the pub opens. I'm stood at the bar with my colleague from Zeneca, who's also called Steve. And in walks this guy called Paul. Paul had made the original phone call to ask me to apply for the job, but Paul had not been involved in the interview process at all. And so he sees the two of us, walk straight up to the bar and stretches out his hand in the classic handshake move to the other Steve and says, "Congratulations on the job." And the other Steve looks at Paul and looks at me and says, "I think you mean him." And in that moment, Paul realized that he had phoned the wrong Steve originally. He'd meant to phone the other Steve. But worse than that, Microsoft had hired the wrong Steve. And this is a genuine, true story. Literally, Microsoft hired the wrong Steve. They were trying to hire Steve Clark, and they hired Steve Clayton. Anyway, so Paul and I decided that we would keep this a secret for a while. And by a while, we mean about 18 years. So about 4 years ago, our chief HR officer invited me to come and speak to all of the HR professionals at Microsoft, 1,500 people in a giant, hotel ballroom here in Seattle. And I thought, this is it, the best of Microsoft HR team. This is the time to unload the wrong Steve story. And so I told them that story of how I got hired into Microsoft. So that's the first very quick story. The second story about the chief storyteller job, I'll try and do even quicker, is I had been working in the UK for about 11 or 12 years, and I'd started to write a blog about the company because I was very frustrated with the public perception of Microsoft. And this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. And the blog got quite popular. It wasn't my day job. It was a hobby. My day job was selling and talking about Microsoft technology. And a couple of years into writing this blog, I got a phone call from a guy called Frank Shaw. And Frank runs communications for Microsoft, runs all of PR and all of communications. Phones me up one evening in London. It was a wet Tuesday evening. I remember it vividly. I picked up the phone again, and this time the voice said, "Steve, it's Frank Shaw." And I knew who Frank was, and I thought, oh dear, this is it. This is the day I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to get fired because of something I did on my blog. And my voice went up a few octaves, and I sort of said, "Well, how can I help you, Frank?" And he said, "Well, I think it's how I can help you." He said, I think you should come to Seattle and do that as a full-time job, that blogging thing. So that's what I did just about 11 years ago, moved to Seattle and began this journey as chief storyteller of Microsoft.
Okay, so for all of you who are joining late, one of the key insights here is all good stories start and end with a good pub or a good drink at many different types of pubs. Tell us a little bit more about your mandate. So you get to Microsoft, you have this mandate. One of the things that I find is so interesting is how you actually build a skill. And so kind of take us through chapter by chapter what you did.
Yeah, well, when I first showed up here, it was the first, I would say, few months was a little bit daunting because remember, I came from an IT background. My profession, what I studied at university was a classic sort of IT course. So I didn't really have a profession in journalism or writing or communications, but I did have a passion for it. And so when I showed up, my job was what we, at least for the first few years, is what we call an individual contributor. So it was just me. And then I got to grow a team, which we can talk about, hopefully. But for the first few years, my job was really to be a spokesperson and a blogger and a so-called evangelist for the company, all around technology and innovation. But I really didn't have much of an idea of how I would do that. So what I started to do in the first few weeks here in Seattle, and we have a huge campus with about 55,000 employees spread across this beautiful green campus up here in Seattle. And I just started to go around and interview people and just talk to people I knew or knew of and ask them if I could have 30 minutes of their time and just understand what they were working on. And then every person I spoke with, at the end of the interview, I said to them, who would be 5 other people that you would recommend I would go and talk to? And so within 2 months, I'd conducted about 45 or 50 interviews with just a group of incredible, talented people at Microsoft in all kinds of different roles. And then I wrote a series of blog posts. So we set up a new blog. We sort of closed my old blog down, set up a new blog that was called Next at Microsoft. And we got ready to launch this blog. And I wrote 5 launch blog posts all about these interesting people that I'd met. And then I spoke to my manager at the time, and I said, okay, we're going to launch the blog next week. And he said to me, great, have you run all of these blog posts past the PR team? And have you run them all past the legal department? And I said, no, I didn't realize I had to do that. And he said, well, you're going to be speaking on behalf of the company, so you really ought to do that. And I thought, this isn't what I signed up for. And so I phoned a friend. I phoned my friend Frank, who'd basically, asked me to move me and my family 5,000 miles. And I remember going home actually the night before and saying to my wife, I said, I think we might have to go back to the UK because I think this job isn't what I thought it was going to be. But I phoned Frank and I said, listen, I would love to just chat with you about some challenges I have. And I sat down with him in a pub, unsurprisingly, a place called the Attic in Madison Park, over a beer. And I said, listen, Frank.
Let me interrupt. The first one was called, I'm going to make a list of these, Steve. The first one was called The Bull in the Pub.
The Bull in Sonning, SONNING. This one is called the Attic in Madison Park.
Rigorous notes for everyone. Keep going.
Okay, so I sit down with Frank and I basically said, listen, I love this job, I'm happy to be here, but I have this real challenge is I've written this content and it's very much written in an authentic, in my voice, and I want to publish. I said, and I didn't realize I had to run this by the PR department and the legal department, and I worry that that's going to water down the message and take away the authenticity. And he looked at me and he just said, Steve, just publish. He said, just go ahead and publish. He says, I brought you here to tell stories, tell the stories. And in that moment, and it puts the hairs up on the back of my neck now, he gave me this permission to just say, go and tell stories on behalf of Microsoft. And I always like to say, what's the worst that can happen? I could get fired. And I'll come back to that. It's a story I tell my team. I have this catchphrase I give them around that. But anyway, so I started to build up this body of content. And then the next few steps in the journey, that was relatively successful, so much so that Frank a few years later came along and said, hey, I think you should take on a team and run our team. That we had a website that used to be called News Center, which really was just a vehicle for releasing press releases at Microsoft. And he said, you should think about how do we want to evolve News Center. And so we started to change how we deliver the news. And then there was this pivotal moment of, which I'm sure some people will remember, of when Snowfall, the story that the New York Times wrote, John Branch wrote this incredible 13,000-word story about a tragic avalanche that happened not far from Seattle, actually, that killed a number of skiers. And the story was incredible. It won a Pulitzer Prize, but the way it was delivered on the web, and this is probably 7 or 8 years ago now, but it still stands the test of time. If you haven't seen it, go and take a look at Snowfall. And its delivery of a story digitally was phenomenal. And I remember, again, talking to Frank on that day, albeit not in a pub, and we said, this is it. This is the future of storytelling. And actually, this is the game that we should get into, is telling our stories in this way, not just as a dry press release, but as immersive content with real journalistic skill sets applied to the storytelling. And so we started to build this team. We launched our own, there's another story about, we created our first owned story, as we called it, that was called 88 Acres, about 3 or 4 months after that shamelessly ripped off Snowfall, and we were shameless about that. And then that just began this journey of storytelling becoming a real discipline and a profession at the company. And there are a few other chapters, but I'll pause there because that's sort of the first couple of chapters.
Great, good place to pause. Let me sprinkle in a couple of comments from the audience. One is from Katya, who just, she argues, sounds very similar to a brand ambassador role, how you might think of chief storyteller. And then, so maybe a little comment about how you think of brand versus story, but also she was wondering about how do you make sure to keep your voice so authentic to Microsoft? You were certainly empowered at the beginning by Frank, but how do you kind of maintain that as you build out the team? Do you want to take one or both of those?
Yeah, I'll take both of them. I think the brand one, it's a really good observation, is the work I do, and increasingly the work I've done over the last few years, has become more and more tied to brand. And I think it is about being a brand ambassador, but being a brand ambassador genuinely for the brand and for the company versus a brand ambassador for the products of the company. And I think that those are two distinctly different things, and neither of them are bad. But all of the work I've done really over the last 10 years has been about building brand awareness and being a brand ambassador, if you want to call it that, a chief storyteller, brand ambassador for the company. So it's very much been about, and that became in some ways an easier job about 6.5 years ago. We changed the mission statement of Microsoft. Satya Nadella became our CEO about 7.5 years ago. And relatively early into Satya's tenure, we changed the mission statement to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And what that gave us was, as storytellers, it gave us this license to say, we can go and tell stories in service of that mission, which we didn't really have before. We'd had mission statements as a company. For example, the first mission statement of Microsoft back in '75 was to put a PC on every desk and in every home, which is a noble mission, but it doesn't really give you a lot of license or cover for telling stories about brand and about the impact a brand has on the world. Whereas empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more gives you a huge amount of landscape to go and tell stories about the impact the company has and didn't really require me to go and talk about products. Not to say I don't like our products, but it's hopefully that sort of answered that question.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, Sid had a related question to Katya's, which is, can you talk a little bit about, as a brand ambassador, as a, storyteller, how do you walk that line between, what is truthful and authentic to Microsoft, and but also kind of representing this larger, higher purpose? And I think what they're getting at is we're at a moment in time where, misinformation and, kind of making things look prettier than they are is something that seems to be something that people are grappling with. How does that fit into your job, or how do you think about these kind of issues between sort of truth versus, the stories that are being shared internally outside to the world?
I think this might sound a bit trite, but I think about it a lot, and I don't think about it because I think, I'm fortunate that I work at a company where we've spent a lot of time very intentionally over the last, I would say, 15 years, really thinking about trust and how do we build trust, and how do we build trust with all audiences, consumers, policymakers, regulators. And the truth is, ironically, we haven't always had that in the history of the company. But I would say that we are in a position where we do have that, and it's not by accident. It's by putting a lot of energy and work and effort into just being truthful, into being honest, into accepting mistakes, into talking about where we need to improve, into not sort of hiding the facts from people. A great example recently was there was a huge cyber attack that became known as SolarWinds, and Microsoft played a big part in that, in both a good way, but also in a way where, we were attacked ourselves from a cyber attack. And what we could have done is hidden that information and not talked about it, because people generally don't want to talk about the fact that they've been hacked. And Microsoft technically wasn't hacked. I won't bore you with the technical details, but we were incredibly public about it because it was important that people got to hear about that people understood the impact of it, companies and individuals, that people got to protect themselves. And so it's, I think one of the things that I think you're getting at in that question is just around how do you, I don't really think about it so much as walking the line. I think about it as just being honest, being authentic, and telling the truth. And then you never will feel yourself on the tightrope having to walk that line. Because you can sort of go home at night and say, we told the truth, we told the right story, and we're not trying to dance on some knife's edge.
Fantastic. I want to go back to the mandate and kind of, the chapters that unfolded. One specific question, talk about how you built the team. So for example, with some companies that I know that build out story as a core capacity, they go from an individual contributor to then having a writer, and then having a filmmaker, and then kind of parse that. And in particular, Arun, I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure, he asked, with the rise of podcast, if you had to go back and do it over again right now, if you're in your position right now trying to build out a team, can you also talk about the role of a podcast versus, script or blog?
Yeah. So in terms of how we built out the team, there were a group of people already on the team that I inherited, this news center team, who were all, came from an editorial background. But really, I think one of the pivotal moments is that when we decided to really get into owned content. And back to that story, I mentioned 88 Acres. The story behind that, you'll be pleased to know, started in a pub. So there was a pub on Microsoft's campus that's called Boardwalk. And I had a meet, or there was a sort of a social gathering at Boardwalk several years ago. And I ran into this guy, Rob, and he said, "Oh, I've got this great story for you, Steve." And it was all about, he said, it's all about real estate and facilities at Microsoft. And I said, "Come on, Rob." I said, "Real estate and facilities?" I said, "We're talking about super cool technology here, and you want me to go and tell a story about buildings?" And he said, "No, I think you should go and explore this story." And so I did. I went and met this guy called Daryl Smith, who basically managed our buildings and, ensured that power came on and lighting came on and there was water to the buildings and stuff like that. And Daryl, true to Rob, he had this incredible story about how our entire campus had been digitized. And so I will get to the answer to the question here. I'm building up to it. So I went and met Daryl, and it's like, wow, this is an incredible story. So we packaged up the story. my team and I, and we took it, and our media agency, and we took it to 3 very large media outlets that I won't name, but every one of them said, no, we're not interested in this story because there's no news here, so we'll pass on it. So that was the point we assigned one of our writers at the time to say, well, we're going to go and do this story ourselves. And we wrote this 3,000-word story called 88 Acres, and we published it. And within 2 days, it was incredibly successful by any measure. It had 250,000 page views. We didn't put any paid media behind it. It generated a whole different story, as it generated within a week a $10 million sales pipeline from this story. And so that was the moment where we said, wow, this is something we have to go and invest in. And my boss, Frank, and actually our CMO at the time, still CMO, Chris Capicella, said, let's go and invest in this. So I began to hire journalists and editors. And so I hired a guy called Michael Wan, who was previously the managing editor of MSNBC.com. He ran a 100-person newsroom, and he came to run and build a team, and still runs a team that is our storytelling, our news centers, if you like, evolution of our news centers team. The short answer to the question, I guess, is we began to hire people from journalistic backgrounds because we really started to think like and act like journalists. But then we started to add different skill sets to that. So we added video capability. We started to think a lot about photography, both of which we contracted in. We didn't have as full-time positions. But the real answer to the question, I think, is this, is that what we hired for is, and what I always hire for, even in my team now, is I hire for curiosity. You want people who are curious about the world, people who are going to walk down a busy high street and notice the one thing that's out of place and say, why is that out of place? And they're going to go and explore it and investigate it and figure out why. And so really what we hire for and the team we built is a people who are just passionately curious about the world, but also tend to have a great background in writing. And then to the question from Arun around podcasts, I have a little bit of a love-hate view of podcast. I love podcasts. I literally listened to 2 on the way into work this morning. I listened to the Daily and I listened to the Politico podcast. But I have this view of corporate podcasts I think are a lot more difficult. And the reason is because there are lots of really great podcasts out in the world already. And so we have a few podcasts at Microsoft, one of which I'm a huge fan of. Our CTO is a guy called Kevin Scott, and he has a podcast called Behind the Tech. And I think it's fascinating because he brings a unique point of view on that. If I went back in time and said, would I do things differently? Would I do a podcast? I think the answer is maybe, but I probably wouldn't do a Microsoft podcast because as much as I love this company and I think we play an important role in the world, I'm just not sure that people wake up in the morning and say, you know what I want? I need a podcast from Microsoft. I think what they maybe do want or would benefit from is hearing from voices at Microsoft in other podcasts, whether that's with Kara Swisher, where our president Brad Smith did a great podcast with her, or when we show up on places like the Daily. And so I love podcasts, but I think there has to be very careful thought about corporate podcasts, because to do them well, and we actually did try one a few years ago on my team that was called Dot Future, and it's still out there and it's still a great podcast, but we put a lot of money into it. Did we get the ROI? I'm not sure we did, because it hasn't existed and continued. Right.
Did you say dark, what was it called?
Dot Future.
Dot Future.
Yeah, now, if you go to microsoft.com/podcast, it sits on that webpage.
Okay, now Steve, if you titled that, all good stories start and end with a good pub. And here are the list of our pubs, which Robin, by the way, is pulling together and I think linking. This morning has just paid for itself. All right, so talk a little bit. We got a great question about how the story has evolved. You've started to take us through the chapters, building out the team, et cetera, when you got to Microsoft. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the story has evolved, especially aligned with this higher purpose that's also evolved since Satya has taken over?
Yeah, I think if I look at all of the work I've done, I would say the work that I'm most proud of and has been the most interesting from a storytelling point of view has been the last 6 or 7 years around a lot of internal storytelling actually at the company, because Satya Nadella became CEO, I think February 4th, 2014, so 7 and a bit years ago now. And I was involved in telling the story around that. Even Satya's announcement, we did in a very different way. The way that you would normally do something like that around announcing a CEO of a Fortune, I'll call it a Fortune 5 company, let me put it that way, is that you would write a press release and you would send it across the wires to AP and Bloomberg and Reuters, and then you would sit back and you would field a set of questions from the media. And we said, we're not going to do that. We are going to create a website, which we did at the time, Microsoft.com/CEO. It was this beautiful website. It had a video of Steve Ballmer, our outgoing CEO. It had a video of Bill Gates. It had a video of John Thompson, our then chairman, and a video of Satya. The video of Satya was a walk and talk interview with me that I'd shot with him 3 days before we announced him. And it was this 3 to 4 minute great discussion of instead of the traditional, let's sit in 2 chairs and have 2 gentlemen talk to each other, we did this walk and talk thing. Anyway, we basically announced the CEO in a way that nobody has ever done, so much so that the Financial Times wrote a story and said Microsoft is doing our job for us and we wish they wouldn't. And that began this journey of us really thinking about how storytelling can help to drive culture change at the company. About a few months into Satya's tenure as CEO, we created what we call the set of cultural attributes of the company, and I'll come back to those. And then we created this new mission statement. And then a small group at the company in the CEO's office, in communications with my team and my boss and a few folks in our HR team, really got together and became this what we called a culture cabinet, who worked to say, how are we going to use storytelling and communications in a not nefarious way, in a very obvious way, to change the culture of this company. And so as an example, I brought some props today. One of the first things that we wanted to, Satya was very keen to change, was shift this culture to what, as many of you will, I'm sure, know intimately, Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, has been like almost the foundation of the culture change at Microsoft. So for folks who don't know Carol Dweck, her book on mindset is phenomenal. So we wanted to launch this idea of growth mindset to Microsoft, where frankly, we didn't have a growth mindset. And we said, well, how are we going to do this with an audience that is going to be very cynical about this type of stuff? And so we sent emails on it. We did lots of different things. But one thing we did as an example, so this is that I'm drinking out of this morning. This is the standard Microsoft coffee cup that you get in little coffee areas across the campus. So a few of us were stood in the coffee area one day looking at this coffee cup and thinking about this challenge of growth mindset and how do we communicate it. And I had this realization that this is the most unused billboard at Microsoft. At least when we came into the office, hundreds of thousands of these things were used on a weekly basis. And so we took a set of quotes from what we called luminaries, and we created a set of custom coffee cups, and I brought a few. So this is our Albert Einstein coffee cup, and it has a quote from Einstein on, "I have no special talent, I'm only passionately curious." And we had one from Sir Ken Robinson. I've got a whole load of them here, from Mahatma Gandhi, from Coco Chanel. And we put these coffee cups out into the world. And I know this sounds ridiculous, but we were constantly thinking about what are tools and techniques and ways that we can capture people's attention. Because back to storytelling and why I think it's important, storytelling, I think, has become more important over the last few years because people have realized that our attention is under attack by data, by information, by billboards, by websites, by radio, by television, by email, by alerts, by text messages. And I believe passionately that is why storytelling has been on the rise, because people have realized that storytelling is what sticks with people. And so we started to explore all of these different ways to tell stories through physical devices like coffee cups, through physical things that we put on our buildings, through it rains a lot here in Seattle. So we painted some of our sidewalks with messages about culture change, and they only became apparent when it rained in Seattle. The messages literally appeared on the sidewalk when it rained. So we just started to explore all kinds of different ways to do cultural storytelling at the company. And I suppose the fast forward 7 years on, has the culture changed at Microsoft? Dramatically, absolutely dramatically. And in fact, the people who are joining Microsoft, we interview people, and 25% of people, I should put it this way, 25% of people who are joining Microsoft are people who are returning to Microsoft. And when we interview people and ask them about that, when they rejoin, and we say, why are you rejoining the company? almost universally they say because the culture has changed so dramatically that it's a company I now want to be back at.
Oh, I love that sentence. By the way, we have to get back to a couple signature quotes of yours, but I want to turn to ROI, return on investment. We got a question. Oh my goodness, by the way, we have a ton of questions. They're just flooding in. So I'm going to be sort of selective here. John asks, how do you connect stories with ROI? So you mentioned before that a story capacity led to $10 million in a sales pipeline. So how do we so I guess this is the two-part question. Talk about ROI of story. And then also, when you think of small and mid-sized firms, any kind of tips and tricks to think about, how to really invest in story in order and to prove out what is the ROI in that case versus, a large company.
Yep. Yeah, back to that 10 million, I sort of just dropped that in there. That does not happen very often. I'll put it that way. We got very, very lucky with our first story. I mean, maybe lucky is a bit unfair because it was a great story. But I'll explain that a little bit, is that we created this story, 3,000 words, spread across 5 chapters, all about this real estate project. And we launched the story on a Tuesday afternoon. And by the Friday evening, Daryl, the hero of our story, which we should also come back to that, of heroes and stories and people, Daryl phoned me up at home on Friday night. And remember, Daryl runs buildings at Microsoft. He's not a sales guy. And he said, Steve, I've just been blown away by the response to the story. And I said, well, that's great, Daryl, tell me more. And he said, well, this funny thing happened the day after the story ran. He said, I got what I thought was a prank phone call. Somebody had phoned the Microsoft switchboard because they didn't have Daryl's number. And they said, can you put me through to Daryl Smith? And the switchboard said, well, who's calling? And they said, it's the office of the governor of the state of Tennessee. And so the office of the governor of Tennessee makes their way through to Daryl. And they said, hey, Daryl, we saw that story you published yesterday, and we would like to buy that. We'd like to buy 88 acres for the buildings that we run in the state offices. And Daryl was a bit confused because he said, well, it's not a product. It's a Microsoft project that we have this internal project, and the code name of the project was 88 acres. And they literally phoned up and said, we want to buy that exact thing you've done at Microsoft. Please, can we buy it? That is now actually a product at Microsoft. It's called City Next, that we sell to cities around the world to help them digitally instrument the buildings in cities. But that was one of 5 or 6 phone calls that Daryl got. He got a very large auto manufacturer in Germany phoned him, a very large chocolate company in Switzerland phoned him, and literally by the end of the week, he had essentially a $10 million sales pipeline. So when I told my boss and I told our CMO about this, they didn't have any questions around the ROI. They just said, oh, this storytelling stuff really works. Let's do more of it. Again, I will say it was a bolt of lightning, that first story, because we've not done many others that have been built a $10 million sales pipeline. But the reason I tell you all of that is a month or so later, I went back to that story and I tried to figure out what was it that made people take that action to say, I'm going to read this story and now I'm going to phone the company and try and buy this thing. And it's really interesting. In 3,000 words of that story, there is a single sentence, only one sentence that mentions product. And I say that to people because you don't need to bang people over the head with your product to get them to buy your product. And, people had literally read this and said, I don't care what it is, I want to buy it, because they bought the story. They bought Daryl's journey. And so that 6 or 7 years on, I keep coming back to and saying to people, let's be careful about the difference between marketing and advertising, which are 2 very important professions that we have a lot of people who work on at Microsoft, and this discipline of storytelling. And they're connected, but to me, they're slightly different. So that's one sort of story around ROI. A couple of other things on ROI. There are some very obvious metrics around, you can look at page views and you could do things like that. And this, again, might sound trite. I will say the biggest measure that we have of return on investment is, do the team go home at the end of the day or the end of the week feeling proud about the stories that they wrote? And I mean that very genuinely and sincerely, is that if we feel proud about the things that we're writing and putting out into the world, then it gets back to the question we had much earlier on around, are we being great brand ambassadors for our company through our storytelling? So then the next piece connected to that is we do brand measurement at the company. And we say, where does Microsoft, a couple of times a year, we'll measure with different audiences how the brand is perceived. And we don't directly connect that back to stories. We could try, but there are so many things that influence people's view of the brand that it would be a difficult job to do. But we sort of take it implicitly that some of the stories that we're telling help with that brand. And, you know, the brand reputation of the company has been on the rise for many years now. And then remind me of the final part of that question. Oh, around small and medium businesses, any advice? My advice, really, this may sound very simple, is just figure out what your story is. Like, really, truly what your story is. And this, back to Microsoft's mission statement, I think we were in the wilderness for a little bit. And this is one of the world's biggest companies, right? With a lot of money and a lot of marketing expertise and a lot of professions. But our story, we'd sort of lost our way a little bit around who we were. We'd achieved this PC on every home and at every desk 5 years, 10 years after that first mission statement. And then we'd have this period of not really knowing what our mission statement was. We had a few, but I think if you ask people at the company, they'd be like, well, I'm not really sure if I can remember the mission statement. Now, I'm going to see if I have another prop around here. Just give me one sec. Something that we did, I convinced our teams to do a few months after we coined this mission statement. So this is my badge from Microsoft, my corporate badge. We redesigned it, made it a bit more modern. But then we put the mission statement on the back of the badge because we want people to see it every day, and we want people to believe it, and we want people to live that mission statement. And that honestly is my single best piece of advice I can give any business of any size, is really figure out who you are and what your story is and what your place on the planet is, and then just be absolutely relentless about telling that story. And if I give you a very quick final anecdote on that, one of the things working with our CEO for these last 6 or 7 years, the thing that I am perhaps most impressed about with him, at least with storytelling, his capacity for repetition is phenomenal. And it's arguably the most important thing in storytelling, is we sometimes give up too quickly on telling a story.
A couple things I wanted to go a little deeper on and grab some questions too. You know, in our class, we talk a lot about people want to be valued members of a winning team on an inspired mission. So you got the new mission statement, that inspired mission, revised and updated. I think Microsoft has just done a really good job of making people feel valued. Even your cup story is in some ways a glimmer into, like, you know, actually making people feel at least valued in the sense that you're thinking, you know, thoughtfully designing around them. Winning what is winning, and you've talked a little bit about sort of good, you know, measures of high performance, I think so well. And then last is, you know, they need to feel like they're part of a team. And so I like some of the ways that you've actually structured your insights around props and quotes and stories and what Satya has done, and this, you know, ability to, you know, be very tight on, the mission and the story. I think that really backs that up. I think another question that Alexandra mentioned was, you know, tell us the elements of a good story. You've dropped in a few implicitly. I don't know if you've noticed, Steve, you know, brings in little details that put people in the room. So when he's sharing a story, even if there's no prop there, you kind of feel like you're part of it, like you're in that pub or the addict or, you know, in Madison, et cetera, with him. The thing that we do, Steve, is we talk about four elements, and I'd love to see if you have other ones that also define a good story. It has a single focus goal. So, you know, there's a reason you're working that story and honing that story and making it sparse and tight and compelling and, you know, human-centric, Daryl-centric. It grabs attention, so it feels fresh. It's engaging authentically. So people often think that stories are these manufactured things, but when it backs up with data, then you get that authenticity that's felt in multiple dimensions and modalities. And then last is people know how to think or feel or do something differently after they heard that story. So they are enabled to take action. And a lot of this is built into our book called The Dragonfly Effect, which is now quite old, but those 4 principles really stand up. You know, what's the goal? How are you grabbing attention? Are you engaging authentically? And are you enabling action? How do you think about what a good story is?
I think I love all of those. I think they're very much aligned with how we think and how I think about stories. I think the single most important one, and I love how you sort of captured. I drop things in. The single most important one is always people, and it's just great stories don't happen without people or a person being at the center of a story, a person being affected. And if I look back 6 or 7 years ago, lots of the so-called storytelling we did, it really wasn't stories in the truest sense, because it was much more about us and about our products. And even some of the early storytelling I did, even though it was about people at Microsoft. And we really changed that. And it's very rare now. If you go to news.microsoft.com, which is the website that the team built called Microsoft Stories, all of those stories, almost every single one, I would say, if you looked at it today, I haven't looked at it this morning, but I will bet they're about people who are being affected in a positive way by Microsoft's technologies and services and products and things that we work on. So it's always about people. But we have a book too. And so this is a book that a group of us at Microsoft created about 2 years ago, and it's called Once Upon a Time, The Art and Craft of Storytelling. And I'm happy to share it with everybody. It's on my LinkedIn page. It's called we call it the 5 Ps. And so when you go inside, it talks about people, place, pictures, personal, and platform. And I sort of chronicled this book over the last few months on my LinkedIn pages if people want more detail. And this doesn't capture everything about storytelling, because I think some of the things that you talked about, Jennifer, are not really in here around, what is the call to action? What is the authenticity? But in terms of the craft of storytelling, if you think about some of the stories I've told, the one about Daryl, it very much was about a person. And I tried to put him in a place. And then when you take a look at the 88 Acres story, you'll see that it has very compelling pictures to support that. And then when we think about platform, back to the question around podcasts, we think a lot about what is the right platform to reach the audience that we're trying to get to. So those are the 5 things that we really think about. Maybe another way to answer the question, and this does go back to, I think, Arun's question earlier around podcasts a little, is if I could do something differently over the last 6 or 7 years that we've done storytelling, I would have invested more and earlier in photography. Partly because I'm a sort of shameless photography geek. I'm a terrible photographer, but I love photography. But that old adage of a picture tells 1,000 words, I think, is even more true in the world that we currently live in. I like to say a picture tells 10,000 words, because we are just as a species, right? We consume visual information so much faster than written information. Like, forget the metrics, but at least 10 times as fast. And there is a reason, right, why websites like Instagram and Pinterest are so popular, because we like to visually consume information. We like to visually share information. That's not to say that I want to get rid of the written word, because I think it's incredibly important and impactful and powerful as a way to deliver stories. But I think a lot, and my team thinks a lot about, how do we deliver stories in a visual way very quickly. And we've had the great pleasure to work with a number of amazing photographers over the last few years to help us do that, and some of the stories we've told.
Great. We have about 15 minutes left. And so what I want to do in those 15 minutes, I want to make sure we get a little bit more into story banking, which I find to be so important. And in particular, also really interested in your signature quotes and Satya's that actually launch a story, or that allow people to understand how you lead and what you believe. So that's 2 topics I'd really like to get to. And then I love to be able to ask a question. There's a couple of questions in the field about global storytelling. Like, how do we think about stories that resonate globally? And then I want to end with a lightning round. So for those of you who are listening, if you have a question for Steve that you think could be a lightning round, just pop it into the Q&A, and I'll pull it out, and I'll give you an example of what a lightning round is. We do this in our class as well. At the end, we save just like 60 seconds and just fire at you, Steve, fast questions like, Hot Pockets or pizza. I'm just kidding. Like, we went on to that. But Arya says,
pizza.
What would you describe? What's one word that you would use to describe the culture of Microsoft? You don't need to ask this now, but I'm just giving you a sense. Like, fire out questions with 1-word answers. So if you are in the chat, feel free to think of lightning round questions. where Steve just answers one word to tackle your question. So let's dive into story banking. This is one reason I originally reached out to you, which is, stories can be such a strategic asset for a company and is often not leveraged. And my dad and I actually have an article called "What is your signature story?" And we define them as intriguing, authentic, involving stories that have a strategic mission, internally or externally. Can you talk a little bit about the process of story banking? And then also, how this relates to you personally or Satya as a leader.
Yeah, I would say on story banking, I'm going to try and keep my answers shorter because we're going to get through a lot here in 50 minutes. Is story banking, I think goes back to this idea of having people who are curious. And I think if you hire people who are curious, then you almost build a natural story bank. With the culture storytelling, we did build a literal story bank where we said, hey, these 5 cultural attributes we have as a company, we want to go out and search for, and almost in an investigative journalist style, we went out and said, hey, let's go and get stories that help to illuminate the story of one Microsoft, or let's go and find stories that illuminate how diverse and inclusive we are as a company, or let's find stories that are, employees of the company demonstrating a growth mindset. And we started to catalog them. Unsurprisingly, we put them in an Excel spreadsheet, the world's most overused database. And that's how we sort of cataloged our stories. But what that allowed us to do is in key moments, often which were Satya keynote speeches outside of the company, sometimes inside of the company, we're able to go back to that story bank and say, hey, we want to close this speech with an emotive, impactful story around one Microsoft or around growth mindset. And we were able to find them very quickly and put those stories into action. And then I'm tempted to go and grab another prop that's somewhere in my office here, but because it goes back to my last point around photography, I think, the most impactful story I've ever been involved in at the company was with Satya. And it was about 6 years ago. And we went to a village called Nanyuki in Kenya, to tell a story that was around how Microsoft technology was being used to connect 30,000 citizens of Kenya who were not connected to the internet, and quite literally changed people's lives. And there's a whole bunch of stories I can tell you there. But part of the reason we told that story was we used it as the backdrop to talk about the mission statement of the company. So back to that mission statement of empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. When you have your CEO stood in a field with the principal of a very small and basic school in the middle of Kenya with one of their students, and you say, this is us living our mission. And we created a set of iconic photography around it, and it became, literally the most amazing story I've ever had the chance to work on.
Fantastic.
I do want to answer one quick question, because you mentioned it a few times, sort of catchphrases. The phrase that this point around curiosity, the phrase that if you ask my team what's he known for saying, they would probably say this. They would say he's known for saying at least once a year, he will say this: if you're not trying something at least once a year that almost gets you fired, then you're not trying hard enough. And I say that fairly regularly to my team. And I do it not because I'm trying to get people fired, but because what I try to do with that is institute a culture that says, I'm encouraging you to take risks. And I think if other people looked at my teams over the last few years, they would, I hope one of the things they would say is, these are teams that have consistently taken risks. They've tried things differently. They've done things differently. They haven't always succeeded. But I think a big part of the culture that we've created and that creates great stories is a risk-taking culture.
Fantastic. Talk a little bit about global. How do you think about, these stories and what you're doing more generally in a way that resonates from a global perspective?
We think about global a lot because we are a global company, and I think we continue to look for ways to bring. It's far too easy for us to tell stories of everything that we're doing in the US because it's a big country and we're doing a lot, and it's home to most of the world's largest media companies that we work with, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or places where we will tell stories on behalf of the company. But the reality is, a lot of if I think about the keynotes, I'll come back to that. The keynotes that I've been involved in over the last 7 or 8 years with Satya and other execs at the company, we've been very intentional about bringing in stories from around the world to say, here is how we are bringing connectivity to 30,000 people in Kenya, or here is how we're helping a farmer in a small village in India be able to get better crop yields and to be more economically successful, or here is how we're helping a small medical company in the UK do better radiology. Or a story I read last night, which is possibly the best headline I've seen all year from our team in Australia, that is how they're using AI and low Earth orbiting satellites to be able to track herds of wild cattle across the vast landscape of Australia. And it's just, so we focus a lot on how do we bring in global stories, and almost over focus on it, because at times it can be too easy to tell local and domestic stories.
Fantastic. Before we go into lightning round, where I'm going to take some of the questions, some of them are dense, but I'm going to try and move them into one-word answers. And I'd like to see, if you could just summarize, if there are 3 things that people attending this session need to know about how to get started, what would be those 3 things?
My first one is back to your quotes. I came up with this one recently, and the most important thing is read widely and share generously, is one thing I've learned a lot over the last few years. It's just, in particular in the divisive world we live in right now, being very intentional about reading widely and then sharing generously and sharing intentionally. So that would be one. The second would be, somewhat connected to that, is just staying curious, just continue to find ways to cultivate your curiosity, go off the beaten path a little bit, read things that, or explore things or watch things that maybe you wouldn't normally watch. So those are 2, and I've got to, on my feet, come up with a third. I suppose the third is really just be prepared to take risks. I would say I gave this TED talk back in my hometown of Liverpool about 5 years ago. And it was ultimately a talk, although there were about 500 people in the audience, but ultimately it was a talk to my 13-year-old nephew who had shown up and was in the audience. And basically what I did is 18 minutes of career advice to my nephew, who was, about to embark upon secondary education in the UK. And ultimately what I delivered in that talk is my entire career has been peppered with taking risks, calculated risks, to say, do I take this job at Microsoft? Do I take this job in Seattle? Do I decide that I'm going to go and talk to my boss and say, I've taken the wrong job, I want to move back? And all along the way, it's been about smart risks. And so I would just encourage people to, to take good risks, because I have this very deeply held belief that taking risks is the key to being creative and innovative.
So inspiring and helpful. I do want to mention that you have a new role, and maybe again, before lightning round, you can just mention the role and what your jurisdiction is, so that the audience can really see the full transformation of not just the evolution of story at Microsoft, but also of your role.
Yeah, the very quick version is my new role is, which I started about 2 months ago, is Vice President of Global Public Affairs. So I sit technically within our legal department, which means I get to work on, learn lots of new interesting language around law and legality and litigation and antitrust and competition and contract law and all of that kind of stuff. But that part of the company also is home to some of the most fertile opportunities for storytelling. As an example, we're doing a ton of work as a company around sustainability and how we can both, as a company, contribute to, reducing the carbon in the atmosphere, but how we can create technology that can help others do that. We're doing lots of work around racial equity. We're doing lots of work around things like, advocating for dreamers. We're doing lots of work around bridging the digital divide, lots of work around how do we reskill a population to get new jobs for the 21st and 22nd century. And so all of those things are just an evolution of where I've been, over the last, I would say, 15 years, frankly, which is telling stories about Microsoft. I love our products, I will tell you that, but the thing I love more than anything is, another thing I say to my teams is, lots of people at the company, their job is to sell Microsoft products. The job of my teams, and I think of my job, is to sell Microsoft. And I don't mean sell in a transactional way. but really to be this advocate. And as somebody said earlier on, this brand ambassador. And now I'm in a place where I've got an even richer collection of stories to go and tell about the impact this company has on the world.
Great. Are you ready for lightning round?
Let's do it.
All right. Which important quality of yours landed you at Microsoft? And you can't say Steve. You can't say your name.
Which important quality landed me here? I would say curiosity.
I knew you'd say that. If you had to condense or capture the culture of Microsoft in one word, what would it be?
Learning.
What do you think is more important? How you say it or what you say in the story?
How you say it.
How many years to go through for a complete switch of culture that's been done at Microsoft?
The answer is it's a never-ending journey.
Favorite social media?
Instagram.
Always a happy ending in our stories, or no?
No.
If you could go back and change something about the way you told a story at Microsoft, what would it be?
Nothing. No regrets.
Oh, no regrets is like another chapter of a good book. How do different stories in a company connect for success? So I guess they're looking for a verb.
How do different stories connect for success?
Like I would say probably
serendipitously.
Ooh, I like that. I was going to say like emotionally, like, that, like if you think about, I often talk about you've got a person and you've got a story, and the resonance of it is like what exists in between, which has a lot to do with, personal connection. All right. One word difference between Microsoft and Apple from your vantage point.
A. We don't have the letter A in our company name.
And a one-word representation of Microsoft as a brand from your vantage point. So not culture, but what it really represents.
Empowering.
This has been amazing. We have like 30 seconds to spare, and Robin, I couldn't be more thankful for you and all of our audience members for being so engaging. I think we had over 100 questions and we were firing at them to Steve. And Steve, you were just so insightful and practical and inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you.
Definitely.
It was great fun.
All of those things. Thank you to you both. It was so much fun. Sometimes in the background, I'm having to do a lot of different things, but I really got to focus, and it was very insightful and very fun. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined us, because as Jennifer said, it's all about questions and the back and forth. It really feels like a live conversation because it's about the people, right, Steve? It's about the people.
That's it. It's all about the people.
That's what makes it so great. Thanks for joining us today. There will be a recording link sent out, and thanks everybody. We're signing off from Stanford. Bye, everybody.